Well, thank you for coming today. This is another version of the Grand Illuminations Unlecture series, as Bill Pelfrey, my partner in crime, likes to call it. The point of this series is to have folks come and share their thoughts about things that matter in a human life. So putting together a meaningful and good life. And today's lecture certainly fits that category. If you've come to any of the other lectures before, you know that we don't really kind of go in for long introductions to these sorts of things. So I just want to say that I'm delighted to have Karen Cherewatuk here today, and I know you will be too once you hear what she has to say. So with that, I will give the floor to you, Karen.
I'd like to thank Bill Pelfrey and Steve Halverson for this opportunity to come to St. Ben's and to St. John's. I would like to thank my husband, Bob Thacker, for much editing. I would like to thank my dear friend, Sean Kohlberg, professor of theology here, who one time was my student at St. Olaf. And most of all, I'd like to thank Tony Cunningham, who invited me to come and who has taken care of many details and treated me with great patience. And thank you all. I understand students, you're just back from break. I'm sure you have a ton of homework that you didn't get done during break. So it is very sweet of you to be here. Thank you. And it's beautiful to have sun in central Minnesota, although the truth is I have absolutely stunning slides, which you are not going to be able to see. So if you want to stick around after, I'll show you on my computer, okay? The room is crowded, the ritual formal. There are prayers, songs, flowers. People wear dark clothing, they sit respectfully. Others give speeches that evoke laughter and tears. We are at where? No! We're at graduation next May at St. John's and St. Ben's. Now, quite frankly, I put the phrase good grief in my title to hook you. In the comic Peanuts by Charles M. Schulz, Charlie Brown exclaims good grief whenever he's frustrated. The phrase originated in the 19th century as a way to replace good God with a more mild expletive. Okay, so Schulz had a lot of fun putting this antiquated phrase in a child's mouth. And I've co-opted the phrase not to address frustration, but to talk about another emotion that most of us would rather avoid, which is grief. You can't see it, but this is a stunning sculpture of a person made out of granite just holding his knees. Who, after all, wants to come to a talk on a sunny afternoon about the sadness associated with loss? We would all rather avoid pain, but in fact, we can't live and avoid loss. You have all been touched by a modicum of grief, and if you haven't yet suffered a profound loss, you may not understand the bottomless depths that you may feel at that point, but you will, and yet you will survive intact, changed, but intact, and that is because the other side of grief is resilience. Now, grief is what I've been studying for several years as a literary critic, and what I'd like to explain is how I became interested in this topic and why it matters to my life and perhaps to yours. I'm going to use a number of terms from counseling psychology, but they're all immediately understandable. And ultimately, I hope to show you that grief can be and most often is good, and that literature can help you practice for and move you from grief to resilience. To redefine grief is good. I turn from the comics to two serious texts and to two different phrases that I'm going to use as touchstones. The sentence, Jesus wept, from the Gospel of John, and the phrase, the grace born from subtraction, from Omeros, which is a contemporary epic by the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott. These two phrases reverberate in my mind. They've become personal mantras. And I'm going to return several times to them, kind of like to home base, as I attempt to explain the goodness of grief. The sentence, Jesus wept, is likely familiar to you. It comes from John chapter 11, verse 35. Mary and Martha, that was my New York coming out, Martha. Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus that their brother Lazarus is sick, indicating to the disciples that he plans to work a miracle. Jesus delays leaving for Bethany. When he does reach Mary and Martha, there it is again. Lazarus has been dead and buried for 4 days. Talking to the sisters and seeing them cry, and their friends cry also, Jesus was deeply troubled and moved. He goes to the tomb and weeps. The response of the crowd is immediate. See how he loved him. Jesus' weeping is not the climax of the chapter. The raising of Lazarus is. And the miracle provides the fundamental message of Christianity, that is, that Jesus brings life. Yet we shouldn't read past tiny verse 35. Jesus wept. For centuries, biblical scholars have used it to prove the humanity of the God-man, to show that he lived in a human body and that he shed tears just as he ate, drank, sweat, and bled. For me, the phrase contains a more important revelation that the crowd, more than the biblical scholars, immediately get. That Jesus loved Lazarus and feels tremendous grief that he died. See how he loved him, murmurs the crowd. In John 11, Jesus proves that he gives life, and yet even knowing this about himself, he grieves, as do all humans. Even more remarkably for me, John 11 shows Jesus experiencing grief in two distinct ways. Most obviously, at Lazarus' tomb, Jesus cries. He feels a personal sense of loss. He does not perform the miracle of raising Lazarus until he feels sorrow and embodies it physically. This is how emotions work. In response to an experience, there's a cognitive reaction felt as an emotion and a concomitant physical reaction. Only after reacting to Lazarus' death, feeling that sorrow, does Jesus move forward. The pattern suggests the way humans deal with grief, not by detaching from pain, but by turning inward and integrating loss. Second, and more subtly, Jesus grieves when he responds to seeing others grieve. The tears of Mary and Martha, their friends, trouble and move him. The movement suggests the motion in the word emotion. The distance between Jesus and the mourners collapses as he feels empathy for them. And in a parallel response, when Jesus weeps, the crowd responds empathically to him. Psychologists call the first kind of grief active grief, the inwardly felt sorrow and display of emotion. For me, this is the face of active grief. It does not come from the depiction of a scene at Lazarus' tomb, but from Rogier van der Weyden's deposition, showing the feelings of those who mourn Jesus as they take his body from the cross. And I want you to notice how the Virgin Mary collapses into a position that actually parallels Jesus' body. That is how deeply she feels grief. And every single face, and I'm happy to show this to you afterwards, these are close-ups of the tears in the eyes of every single face in that painting showing active grief. Now, in addition to active grief, the second kind of grief I want to address is that response to other people's pain, what psychologists call various grief. It's what you would be feeling if you could see these faces. The emotions felt are likely not as intense as your own feeling of active grief, but the emotion is real. You've taken another person's sorrow upon yourself, and it's not anything you decide. It just happens automatically. Many of you probably felt this if you watched President Zelensky's address to Congress and that 3-minute video sequence of life in Ukraine. You probably felt vicarious grief. So, grief is either the personal emotional response or it's an empathic reaction. Good grief of either variety makes us kinder, fundamentally more human. Jesus' embodiment of grief in these two ways is, for me, the important lesson hidden in the phrase Jesus wept, and it's a lesson hidden in very plain sight. Now, like Mary and Martha, I have stood at the tomb, and for longer than 4 days. First, I grieved the loss of my first child, and 10 years later of my first husband. Helen died when she was 12 of a neurologic disease that had plagued her for half her life. Before her actual death, there were 1,000 cruel losses. Helen began first grade by hopping on the bus, but within weeks, her limbs had stiffened so she could no longer get down from the step. By Christmas, she had a walker. By the end of the school year, a wheelchair. In 3rd grade, Helen lost the ability to speak. In 4th grade, she lost the use of fine motor skills. This was especially hard to watch because Helen was an artist, but she could no longer hold a pencil or a paintbrush. And because she could no longer type, she couldn't speak through her voice activation computer. She did not lose her intelligence. She could communicate clearly through eye directions and eye blinks. But people infantilized her, and that reaction hurt too. These kinds of losses are what University of Minnesota psychologist Pauline Boss calls ambiguous loss. So ambiguous loss is when you have a sense of grief that doesn't close. In our family, ambiguous loss beset both Helen, who was experiencing her own crushing decline, as well as her caretakers. Helen's disease for us in her family was an experience of anticipatory grief, which is the period in which one dreads a loss to come that seems inevitable. Helen's sister, our younger daughter Mary Claire, understood that inevitability even though she was only in 2nd grade. She frequently left the house saying, "Bye, Helen, you're the best sister in the world." And those, in fact, were Mary Claire's last words to Helen as she went out the door one night for a sleepover. The next morning, I went to Helen's bed and found that she had passed away during the night. That is when anticipatory grief gave way to active grief, and the weeping began. Not a decade later, I lost my first husband, Rich, to cancer. He was 55, I was 52. That might sound very old to you, but it's really not. An English professor, Rich returned from teaching a January interim in Ireland, telling me that he'd felt better than he had in years. He played soccer with the students every day or hiked with them. But he thought he picked up a virus on the plane. That virus turned out to be advanced cancer. The diagnosis was a terrible blow for a couple who'd shared the loss of our daughter. Our marriage had endured an unnatural reversal of chronology. We buried a child when she should have buried us. Most marriages do not survive that loss. And then cancer took Rich 9 months after initial diagnosis. A specialist in early modern literature, Rich was well enough to stand up and give a lecture on Milton's Paradise Lost the week before he entered hospice. And then a week later, he was gone. How did you survive? People sometimes ask. Well, daily heroism is what you do when you have no choice. And my burden was heavy, but it was not tragic. There are truly tragic events, hurricanes, this pandemic, the war in Ukraine. Tragedy demonstrates humanity's capacity not only to survive, but to thrive in the midst of cataclysm. The news, yes, but also personal experience and literature teach us that we are survivors. We are created, literally programmed, to feel not just sorrow in loss, but sorrow mixed with hope or joy or contentment. In grief, those positive emotions keep us afloat until we reach a new balance. In other words, in grief, we experienced resilience alongside sorrow. Now let's clarify what grief is by articulating what it is not. Grief is not work, as Sigmund Freud inaccurately theorized in 1917. In Mourning and Melancholia, Freud famously argued that the survivor must redirect the libido from the deceased loved one in order to invest emotional energy elsewhere. For Freud, recovery from grief means breaking emotional attachment, what he calls object cathexis, to achieve closure. So the work of grief for Freud is breaking emotional attachment. And in my experience, this makes utterly no sense. This is nonsense, because survivors do not ever completely detach from loved ones. For those who love, grief becomes less intense, but it does not close. Memories return us to loss. Most obviously, memories come back on anniversary dates, a birthday, a graduation, but sometimes they come when we least expect it, with stabbing freshness. Assuredly, grief is not work that ends. Nor is grief a movement through stages. Working with cancer patients, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross theorized that the dying pass through 5 emotional stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. My husband, Rich, certainly achieved what Kubler-Ross sees as that end stage, acceptance. His death was as natural as his birth. It was simply beautiful. He died reciting almost every poet he had ever memorized, from John Donne to Seamus Heaney. He recited poems about memory and death, giving those of us at his deathbed a taste of eternity through art. And that's because Rich understood that art, and poetry in particular, have a healing power. The beautiful ambiguities of a poetic phrase can help you make sense of your experience. To quote Professor Tony Cunningham, whose talk opened this series, "Great lines stay with us. They are like tumblers in a lock when suddenly the words click into place and make sense, not in themselves, but of your life." And the phrase, "Jesus wept," worked that way for me. So according to Kubler-Ross, Rich's poetry-filled end marked acceptance. Now, followers of Kubler-Ross have applied her theory not just to the dying, but also to the bereaved. And some of the stages ring true to my experience. I spent a lot of time on my knees trying to bargain with God. Please, God, spare Helen and take me. God, if you let Rich live to Mary Claire's high school graduation, well, God didn't. And I sometimes felt anger, and eventually I came to acceptance. But I never experienced any orchestrated order of emotions. Kubler-Ross's 5-stage theory is now being debunked, at least as it applies to bereavement. After a debilitating stroke, Kubler-Ross herself spent 9 years dying. In her final book, she lamented the misapplication of her theory. Our society, she said, places enormous pressure on us to get over loss, to get through grief, and I never have. So if grief isn't the work of emotional detachment, and it's not emotional stages, what is it? At its most basic level, grief is the sorrow experienced when someone or something is taken away, subtracted from us. The experience that I described in my interpretation of John 11 of grief as personal response to pain or as a response to other people's pain comes from the resilience theory of grief. This is one of the current dominant models of loss today, articulated by psychologist George A. Bonanno, among others. Resilience theory holds that after survivors experience the initial overwhelming onset of loss, we redefine ourselves and move forward. So sorrow turns us inward. It slows us down so that we can integrate loss, adjust our sense of self in response to change. To cite a poignant example, when my husband Bob lost his father to a sudden fatal heart attack one December 23rd, his mother sat in the chair rocking, repeatedly asking, "Who am I now? Who am I?" Grief's inward turn allows us to confront that question. Who am I in this changed circumstance, in my now changed world? But grief, like any emotion, creates not just those internalized feelings, but externalized facial expressions and physical responses, like tears. Those around us react to our loss. So while bereaved survivors are programmed to turn inward and look downcast, the people around them are programmed to respond with empathy, just when the bereaved are most vulnerable. There's an exchange, as it were, of sadness and empathy. Think of Jesus' reaction to the crowd of mourners and their reaction to him. He weeps, they are moved. They weep, he is moved. The bereaved eventually begin to turn their focus from themselves outward and back to other people. So for bereaved survivors, grief may actually involve two separate psychological processes, one oriented toward loss and another toward restoration, a kind of cross current that leads to resilience. Now, as I've just explained, grief, like any emotion, is functional. It serves a purpose. And like any emotion, grief is temporary. Even in the initial period, the survivor does not stay long in the utter depths of sorrow. At funerals, as at graduation ceremonies, we hear laughter. In grief, feelings of sorrow mix with positive emotions, sadness, but also gratitude for the person who has died and for others who offer support, and in my case, gales of laughter upon discovering that all of my nieces have the same Durocher nose as my husband and daughter. So waves of sorrow were met by the gravitational pull of positive feeling. And it's the positive emotions that allow the survivor to turn back to the world little by little. 2 weeks after the death of my daughter, and also after the death of my husband, I went back to work. I thought that I wanted normalcy, routine, something I could control, because death is not too easy to control. And quite frankly, teaching made me feel good because I was still good at it. In hindsight, I realized that what I wanted was to connect with my students in that blessed space of the classroom. Students gave me joy. In active grief, negative and positive emotions oscillate, with sadness dominating. In time, however, the waves of sorrow spread further apart. Oops. Sorry, there's a really great picture of crashing waves. There we go. In times, however, the waves of sadness spread further apart and are balanced by positive feelings. And in time, I achieved a new equilibrium, and I wasn't just floating, I was swimming again. Now, most people reach equilibrium within 6 months of a major loss. Not everybody, because complicated grief is a serious problem, and people may need treatment from it. But for most of us, loss yields to resilience. We carry the grief within us. It's part of our new identities, but we find ourselves satisfied, maybe even happy with our changed lives. And studies show that experiencing loss makes the bereaved kinder and actually less judgmental of other people. And so, too, does the experience of participatory or vicarious grief. So paradoxically, even though we would all rather avoid grief, grief is the grace born from subtraction. And so I arrive at my second touchstone phrase, the grace born from subtraction, which comes from Walcott's Omeros. Now, thus far I've talked about grief as a response to death, but we all know that there are many kinds of losses. We grieve in response to broken relationships, to the deprivation of our COVID lives, to our divided political system, to the racism that took the life of George Floyd right near here in Minneapolis. We grieve alone, for like any emotion, grief is felt individually, internally, and in that way, any emotion parallels death. Yet humans mourn in groups, often in public through rituals, at funerals, memorials, street protests. Rituals allow us to share active grief or to create ties through participatory or vicarious grief. And those ties of participatory emotion create understanding. And that is why I love Walcott's poem, Omeros, which incidentally is the Greek word for Homer, okay, the ancient poet. I return to reading this poem again and again because it describes many experiences of grief and many ways of resilience. I first heard Walcott read from a draft of Omeros at St. Olaf College in 1988. Walcott said most of the poem in his home country of St. Lucia, but the section he was then working on examines the genocide of our Native Americans. Hearing Walcott led me to examine the history of my adopted home state, Minnesota. 2 years later, in 1990, Walcott published the poem. In 1992, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, in part because of this epic achievement. My chair and good friend, chair of English that is, and good friend Jonathan Hill, taught a study abroad program during our January term in literature of the Eastern Caribbean. After 10 years of teaching Omeros, but immediately after my daughter Helen's death, I walked into Jonathan's office and asked, "When you go to the Caribbean next time to teach, can I go with you?" I did, and so began this medieval scholar's obsession with the literature of the Eastern Caribbean. I understood intuitively that one way to deal with grief is to embrace change. Now, Omeros is a very layered narrative, and I'm going to ask you to be a little patient with me as I try to summarize a very complicated plot. The main plot is the story of a fisherman, Ashi, who competes with his best friend, Hector, a cab driver, over a housemaid named Helen. If you've read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you will hear in these names echoes of the Homeric characters, Achilles, Hector, Helen. Walcott's names, however, are in St. Lucian patois. This is a French-based patois, and it's the unofficial language of St. Lucia, descended from its slave past. In its colonial days, St. Lucia changed hands between the British and the French 13 times, ultimately landing in English possession. But Hélène remains the French name for the island. Now, I'm telling you this little history so that you understand how the plot of Omers functions at two levels. One, there's a competition between between two men for one woman, and that echoes the Helen of Troy story. At the same time, the character of Helen represents the island of St. Lucia, and Walcott uses her to examine the effects of colonial domination. In Omeros, Walcott echoes all of the West's epics, not only Homer's, but Virgil's Aeneid, Dante's Divine Comedy, Milton's Paradise Lost, Joyce's Ulysses. They're all in there. Now, he uses these epic echoes and the epic form to indict Western colonization, the transatlantic slave trade upon which it depended, and the racism left in its wake. In terms of primary plot, then, Omeros examines the history of slavery in the Caribbean basin. But in its multiple layers, the poem shows the working world of very ordinary people and the many causes of our griefs. Some of these losses are ambiguous, that is ongoing. There's the identity of the immigrant who misses her home country and who doesn't know if her new country will ever accept her. There's a soldier who carries the trauma of a head wound decades after the war has ended. There's the missing child of an infertile marriage. There's the pain of watching a parent decline into the fog of Alzheimer's. "Who am I?" says the narrator. "Mama, I'm your son." In addition to these ambiguous losses, there are permanent changes that bring active grief. The narrator divorces. Ashi learns the death of his best friend Hector in a car crash. And a man named Dennis Plunkett loses his wife Maud to the empire of cancer that spread across the wrinkled sheets. Walcott puns relentlessly. And here, the wrinkled sheets suggest the bed she died in, as well as her shrinking body. The metaphor of a creeping empire strikes survivors of a cancer death as immediately right. Now, for Walcott, the history of empire too is a cancer eating the individual and the societal body from the inside. Chattel slavery is another of the terrible causes of grief. Chattel slavery was the practice that made Africans the property of others, and it is so totalizing a grief that it actually passes down through generations. Chattel is the old-fashioned word for movable property. Etymologically, it's related to cattle and to capital. In denying Africans a soul, chattel slavery turned people into capital and treated them as cattle. And I'm going to give you a trigger warning. The next slide contains extreme violence against blacks. Slavery erased the enslaved person's family and tribe, nation, as well as way of life, language, and even personal name. The phrase grace born from subtraction is about surviving slavery. It comes from a book in the epic in which Ashi follows a sea swift on the bird's migratory path from the Caribbean to Africa. And at least in his mind, Ashi journeys to Africa. There he discovers not darkness, as in Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, but his ancestors. In a painful first meeting, a father figure learns that in the New World, Ashi no longer has an African name. The ancestor explains the tribal practice of naming and then reacts in shock. A name means something, the qualities desired in a son and even a girl child. So even the shadows who called, you expect one virtue, since every name is a blessing. Did they think you were nothing in the other kingdom? Ashi's father grieves his son's unnaming and status as nothing in the new world. In turn, after living among his African family, Ashi witnesses their capture in a black-on-black slave raid. Ashi is the only man not taken, and he and readers suffer as we watch the tribe sold to white slavers and then dehumanized. The narrator comments about the ancestors' forced migration. But they crossed, they survived. There is the epical splendor. Multiply the rain's lances, multiply their rune, the grace born from subtraction as the hold's iron door rolled over their eyes like pots in the rain, and the bolt rammed home its echo. For Walcott, the epic hero is not a victor in battle, but those who endured the middle passage between Africa and the Americas. The enslaved endured the loss of absolutely everything as the ship's iron door rammed its bolt and erased home. Ashi realizes in a flash, now they were dismembered branches, not men. Their subtraction is nearly total. Ashi's vision of the slave hold gives him an experience that is at once active and anticipatory. One usually experiences anticipatory grief and then active grief, but for Ashi, it's all mixed up. He loses the family that he has come to understand, and at the same time, he anticipates what they are to suffer in the slave trade, which they don't know about, but he does. Ashi watches the enslaved men weep, not for their wives only, their fading children, but for strange, ordinary things. Walcott applies the adjective fading to the Africans' memories of their children, their tools of trade, their language, their names. Their sense of time grows dismal. Always the word never, and never the word again. How is resilience to be found in the hold of a slave ship or in a life of slavery? As in the phrase Jesus wept, the answer is hidden right in the open in Walcott's first description of slavery. They crossed, they survived. To lose everything and yet to endure in the face of absurdity is an act of will and an act of faith. Sometimes just surviving is the fullest possible demonstration of resilience. My colleague Gordon Marino, in the previous talk in this series, spoke about the existential philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. For Kierkegaard, choosing to live in the face of absurdity is an heroic act. And what could be more absurd than living under slavery? The grief Ashi experiences in his middle passage, both active and participatory, becomes good. It leads to his inward turn, that time of redefinition and reconsideration. He does not distance himself from his ancestors' suffering, but rather he integrates it into a new sense of identity. Ashi emerges from his visionary experience as a proud African, and I would argue as Kierkegaard's knight of faith. Now, in that phrase, the grace born of subtraction, the use of the noun grace suggests something more than physical beauty or elegant matters. Like faith, grace is a religious gift, and Walcott, a Christian writer, understands that. He once said in an interview, "I have never separated the writing of poetry from prayer." When Walcott uses the word grace, he does so in the full sense of a gift that is divine and unmerited. Grace reappears in a second scene of subtraction at Maud Plunkett's funeral mass after she dies of cancer. Maud's husband Dennis and Ashi know each other from the days when weather kept Ashi out from fishing, and he instead picked up odd jobs on Plunkett's farm. Exploring the effect of participatory or vicarious grief, the narrator in the poem, who is Walcott, watches Ashi as Ashi watches Dennis at his wife's funeral. This is the narrator speaking. I recognized Ashi. He stood next to Philoctet in a rusted black suit, his eyes anchored to the pew. Then he lifted them, and I saw that the eyes were wet as those of a boy, and my eyes were watering too. Why should he be there? Why should they have come at all? None of them following the words. But he had such grace that I couldn't bear it. I could leave the funeral, but his wet ebony mask and her fish-netted face were shrouded with Hector's death. Could he, in that small suit too tight at the shoulders, who shoveled the pens in the rain at Plunkett's farm, love him? Where was it from, this charity of soul more piercing than Helen's beauty, runneling his face like the road to the farm? Standing next to Helen, who is covered with a veil, her fish-netted face, Ashi weeps, as does the narrator, and in my experience of teaching this poem, every reader of this scene. Ashi, a descendant of Africa with a face like an ebony mask, responds in participatory grief, automatically taking on the pain of the white widower Dennis, a descendant of British colonizers. Ashi's embodiment of empathy reveals such grace that the narrator couldn't bear it. The scene of Maud's funeral demonstrates yet another aspect of grief's mysterious workings. It shows Ashi grieving not just with Dennis for Maud, but also for his friend Hector, whom he has just buried. Walcott thus beautifully captures the way for mourners one death echoes another. And this is my experience at funerals. You do not cry when you are the widow or daughter standing on display. You stand like retired General Major Dennis Plunkett, straight as a mast without a sail. But at every funeral thereafter, you relive your loss in empathy for the brave survivors whom you watch. Ashi stands as a new kind of epic hero, the person who displays such grace and charity of soul that grief runnels his face. And the narrator responds in empathic grief to Ashi that ripples out to touch the audience outside the scene. In Omeros, love survives enslavement, and at Maud's funeral provides healing across boundaries of race and class. How does Walcott do that? How does he shift participatory grief from a character in a scene onto readers? Why do we cry at Maud's funeral? The way a reader's emotional response work is a subject of a whole nother field called the psychology of fiction. And it's late in the afternoon to hit you with a whole nother field of research. So I'm going to articulate one obvious point. Readers naturally empathize with characters who are in painful situations, like a funeral. In fact, we respond when reading automatically with grief, as if we would respond that way in real life. Literature gives us mirror characters who model for us ways of expressing emotion, including grief, sorrow, and resilience. Responding to characters in literature gives us practice in good grief. Walcott's perfect description of loss evoke in me my own grief experience. His language stays with me, particularly the paradox expressed in the phrase, grace born from subtraction. And charity more piercing than Helen's beauty. For Walcott, physical beauty cannot compare to Ashi's charity, his complete and loving empathy for another bereaved survivor. How could I, with my real, but quite frankly, private grief, not want to survive when I could read a poet who gives me an entirely personal understanding of slavery, and who gives me a hope through a hero who is famous for loving? This is the exact same charity that Jesus shows when he weeps for Lazarus and takes on our humanity right down to our tears. The grace born from subtraction, charity of soul more piercing than beauty. Jesus wept. These phrases spoke to me in the depths of my sorrow, in part because I was open to their message. I was already on my way to experiencing the resilience that's the other side of grief. Certain social and genetic factors seem to make resilience come more easily to some than others. And socially, I was blessed with financial security as well as supportive family and friends. And psychologically, I tend toward optimism. But I believe that you can cultivate resilience even if you tend toward pessimism or depression. I chose small steps and a routine to help with loss. When my daughter Mary Claire left for college, I found myself truly living alone for the first time. If Helen had been there, if Rich had been there, if Mary Claire had been there, I would have insisted on eating a delicious dinner. And so I made the decision that I was worth cooking for, and I did it, and I ate well every night. I also work to sustain the memories that honor my loved one. I wear the ring that my father gave my mother on a trip to Greece, and I returned to writing scholarship because that was the part of Rich I most admired. Dennis Plunkett, too, celebrates Maud's memory with quiet domesticity. He knew that Maud was proud of him whenever the squared sunlight shone on the taut comforter, that it was so well made. In making the bed, just the way his wife liked it, Dennis honors her and integrates her memory into his new daily routine. We all know that the best way to get yourself going is to get out of bed and to make it so that you can't get back into it. We don't need to read an epic to teach us how to make the bed. But literature can remind us that resilience comes through loving self-care in the face of change. That memories of loved ones steady us for the rest of our lives. And that daily, simple work done with grace is heroic. I probably don't need to make this last point about simple work done with grace in a Benedictine community. And I honor you, sisters, for that life. Life will teach you the ways of resilience, but literature can prepare you to embrace the grace born from subtraction. Listen when a poetic phrase calls to you. Memorize it. It will return to you when you need it. Essentially, grief teaches us what we love and how to love others after loss. And that is indeed good. Thank you.
We have a little while for not just questions, but a conversation, hopefully. So I know you perhaps you have your own personal stories, you have something that you'd like to share, you may have a question. I can move a lot faster than I look these days, so if you need this, just give me the high sign and I'll be there to give you this microphone. Who will start us?
I'm curious about what you do to survive your losses. It's true confession time. Yes? Did you raise your hand? No, no, no. No.
Something I find myself doing is just thinking a lot about that person, remembering all the good times we had and the relationships we had, and kind of sensing that person around me often,
Mm-hmm.
pictures around. And so I think I don't grieve real deeply. I always feel I just kind of accept that that's life, but I don't want to forget the person.
Mm-hmm. There's a book, the title escapes me right now, but it's written by a Minnesotan forensic pathologist. And she wrote the book after she had had so many experience of patients' families coming back and saying, I had this experience of this person coming back to me. And that is far more common in America than is usually reported. According to this book and also Bonanno's book, about 40% of Americans, when asked, will say that they feel their loved one with them in a very concrete way. Sometimes they see them, sometimes they hear them, sometimes they dream about them, but many, many people actually feel the presence of that loved one.
I was very close to my mother, and when she was in the nursing home and I was still teaching, I'd go see her all the time. And she couldn't see me coming because she had macular degeneration. But when she heard my voice, she would just light up. And then one time when I came, she just held my face between her hands and kissed me all over. She didn't say anything. But the thing I want to say about handling the grief and how that it just doesn't go away, you never have closure. Sometimes what I started to feel was my mother was more present to me in her absence than she was present sometimes when I was sitting next to her.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something I had never thought about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's still true.
Mm-hmm.
And not just about her. I think it's kind of what you were also saying when you said it occurs on birthdays, memories of holidays. It could be just the smell of some food she made that you liked.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I think it's a good kind of grief to have her present in her absence, even though that doesn't sound like it might make a lot of sense.
I'm thinking a little bit about the grief that college and university students are probably most familiar with, and that's the bad breakup. When you're still in love and you've been dumped. I think that that's an interesting one to kind of live through, and it doesn't help to have old people say, don't worry, there are other fish in the sea, there are other pebbles on the beach. I think you just have to believe in yourself and know that you are really, truly, deeply lovable, and also still really good looking. Yeah.
I'm Lydia. I'm a Peace Studies major here.
What kind of major?
Peace Studies?
Okay.
Yeah. And a question I have, we may not have the answer for it, just something more to think about is, and it rises from, I've never experienced like a significant loss, but I am somebody who has survived trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so, anticipatory grief is something that I deal with, and that is arises in my day-to-day life. And so, how do we deal with, or how do we thrive in resiliency while dealing with like the anticipation of like, or like the dread of grief?
Yeah, boy, I don't know.
And I think the answer would be different for every person, but.
Yeah, I think those who have survived trauma, say victims of abuse who have had their innocence taken away, or there are just so many forms of trauma. I think those people deserve our utmost gentleness. And it's so hard because everyone has some kind of burden, and we often have no clue of what other people are carrying. Does anybody have a response? How do you deal with the anticipation? You're traumatized by something, and you anticipate having to face a situation. I'm going to call my husband. Bob, do you have an idea? How do you like that?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. When you're dreading something, you're anticipating something, particularly if it's a traumatic experience, how do you deal with that sense of dread as you go into what you know is going to be a nerve-wracking experience? And that was really, really sad that I just did that to Bob. Do you want to clarify?
What I consider another is just like another layer of it too is that like negative experiences bring us into resiliency, and so almost thinking of it as like a battle between like thriving in resiliency and dealing with like active anticipatory.
Boy, that was so well said. I don't know if all of you heard that, but it's almost like a battle between anticipatory grief and resilience. And maybe you've just in part answered your question, that if you face, once again, that dread, you are cultivating resilience. And I'm sorry, Bob, did you want to say anything?
She took the words right out of my mouth. No, I would add something. I think that when I'm in a situation dealing with anticipatory grief and it's gnawing at me, I continually have to remind myself that I really don't know what I'm dealing with. And I often think one of my favorite expressions of all time is from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who says, "Dismiss whatever insults your soul." And so I find myself saying that, dismiss whatever insults my soul. And it helps me relieve that pressure and that fear. And until the next time I feel it.
Thank you.
I actually have a funny little story that will tie into this. When my mother was dying, I was sitting next to her one day, and she was in bed, and she suddenly said, "Freedom isn't free." And I thought, God, that's an unlike thing for my mother to suddenly say. And it was a great mystery to me. And she was declining. And, you know, it was the sort of thing that I don't know where this came from, whether she was watching the news or something. And then shortly after she died, we were collecting in the nursing home some blankets and things. And I saw that on a blanket, it was written, "Freedom isn't free." So that she was simply reading this thing on the blanket that I didn't see. And I mention this because, you know, my mother was renowned for having this great laugh. When she left Ireland, right as she was leaving, this priest said to her, "Now, Lizzie, when you get to America, just let out one good laugh because we're sure to hear it all the way back here." And she was quite proud of her laugh. And, you know, when I realized that she had read this, I had such a good laugh. And when I showed my brother Kevin this, you know, we had this wonderful, wonderful laugh. And there are times when, if I really have a good laugh, I think back to that moment, and it's an admixture of terrible sorrow, but also just this sense of joy. So and grief is often like that. It often has this kind of complication that you have these things that are at odds that you're feeling at the same time, which on paper it seems like you shouldn't be able to feel these two contrary emotions at the same time, but I often do.
I have found, excuse me, that our culture does not do death well. And there seems like people are very uncomfortable in talking about many aspects of it, even using the word dead. You know, they'll say, you know, they've passed, or they use a term to soften it like that somehow makes it less dead. Or they come up to you and they say something really stupid or something really flat out painful, you know, and it's like, and you're thinking, what about that do you think makes me feel better? You know, but through all of it, I guess one thing I've learned is just to extend people grace, because obviously they haven't been through, you know, some of the more serious losses, and they're trying to help, but they just lack in, you know, their ability to do so. But yeah, so I guess I would say just extend grace to them.
I think one of the other things I've come to realize is that funeral ceremonies have those who are the family who feel the loss at a very different place from the community who comes. So those of us who have felt it most intensely, we've kind of moved in are like several steps ahead of the public that comes. And then you have to take on all of their stuff as they say these silly things like, well, she's in a better place, and and it's not helping you. But it is interesting the way, you know, you're kind of over here, and all those people who show up at the service are over here, if we can even have services. I mean, think of all the backed up grief we have experienced in COVID. It's really quite remarkable.
This is maybe going back a little bit to Tony's comment and the student's question up front. But when I was thinking of just your story about your mother and that laugh, notes I took from the very beginning of your talk, where you talked about grief as there being a cognitive reaction felt as an emotion and as a physical reaction. And it sounded like kind of that's what was happening with you, with your mother. And I know psychologists who work on trauma talk so much about how trauma gets stuck in your body. It's embodied. And what I loved about that description that you had, the cognitive, the emotional, and this physical reaction, you know, that sounds so much like what trauma theorists say about that process of you have to get that trauma out of your body. You need to have, you know, of course, therapists want to say with the help of a therapist, you know, to do this kind of somatics and this somatic practice in order to express that out of your body, so that, you know, maybe something like that when you're talking about the anticipation of the trauma, you know, that it makes me wonder, and I'm a philosopher, I'm not a psychologist, I'm just reading them in my spare time, if part of what needs to happen is that that trauma is still stuck in your body, so you're having that anticipatory, it sounds like traumatic reaction, where you need help with a community or a therapist or a set of embodied practices that you're using yourself to kind of express that out of your body, so that to lower your hypervigilance, right, and to help you to deal better with such situations in the future. So.
So I have a response directly to that I was thinking as during these same conversations. So I am in Tony's class right now. It's not the only reason I'm here. But we talked in our class about how trauma gets stuck in your head in that you are literally reliving it. It doesn't leave because you haven't processed it. And the way that humans do that is we tell stories. You know, when we need to make other people understand us, we say how we got to this point. We read a story in class about a woman who is just on the verge of doing something terrible and talks to a stranger, a complete stranger talks to her on a plane, and she spills everything. She spills her guts on this plane, and she is saved by it. And I think there's something very powerful in storytelling, in not only listening to, you know, our wonderful guest Karen talk about her experiences, but sharing our own, that I think makes it such a powerful storytelling experience. Really grateful for that. And before I hand the mic back, thank you for mentioning graduation. Again, as a student, the other terrifying thing is realizing that we'll have to go out in the world and make decisions for ourselves and know what we're doing in a world that is changing so rapidly. You know, I'm a junior, but I have senior friends who are leaving very, very soon. I'm sitting next to one of them. And, you know, it's its own kind of grief, too. The loss that can happen when our lives change suddenly or even slowly is an opportunity for this grief and also the joy and positivity that come with it. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. You know, I think the other side of that is to give people grace not to have to repeat their stories if they don't want to. So for a while, I was the widow in Northfield, Minnesota, so that every time someone's husband died, people were calling me up and saying, Karen, would you mind having coffee with so-and-so? Her husband just died. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not a psychologist. I'm just a person. So sometimes also extending grace is just letting people have their own space too.
So I'm sure you've thought of this before, and so I'm just curious what you would say to your students, because I think it's important to name it in this space. So I'm sure you're familiar with the critique of resilience, right? The notion that by demanding resilience of people who've been traumatized, right, are we asking too much when really, for example, instead of asking for resilience from sexual assault survivors, we need to change rape culture. People need to stop raping rather than, you know, survivors need to become more resilient. So I know you have a good answer to that, and I'd like to hear what you would say to that critique that resilience maybe isn't always our goal.
You know, I do not claim to know much about trauma theory, and I don't want to speak in any kind of a condescending manner to anyone who's suffering any kind of trauma. My own trauma is loss of family. I agree with you absolutely that we have to end a culture that believes that practices sexual violence every single day in 1,000 small ways, in that everyday sexism that all of us have experienced at some point in our life. And I agree with you entirely. I don't think we should demand resilience from people who are deeply injured. I think we ought to give them medical care, quite frankly, and I think it should be widely available because the abuse is so widespread. It's funny that you mentioned that. I was just teaching feminist theory yesterday, and this is a very small example of everyday sexism. But I reported that my starting salary at St. Olaf College was $18,000. that was a great salary in 1986, or at least I thought it was, and that a colleague of mine who was hired the same year made $4,000 more, which is a lot of money when you're making $18,000. And when I brought that to the dean, he said, well, he's a father, and you're not. And I said, I have my PhD done, and his is incomplete. And that was just, that was just one example. And my students think this is ancient history, but it happens every single day. Women, when you go out to negotiate your salaries, ask for more. Find out what the men are making and ask for the same or more. And that's a whole different story, sorry.
This is about grief when it can be just so paralyzing for some people, where they just, they feel like they're underwater.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to describe it for some people, but I've had to go through quite a bit of grief in my life, and so have many of the people in the room. And one of the things as an energy worker that I've learned that has helped me is to notice how often we rehearse something in our minds about an experience that has either happened to us or a death or something. What is the recurring video that goes through our mind about that thing or experience? And one question from someone who maybe isn't quite so sounding empathetic could say to one, so who's hurting you now? Is that person or that thing that hurt you before or that death, who's dying now? Are you doing it to yourself as you bring it into your mind? That was sort of presented to me as a question once, and I thought, as sometimes you can perceive something as being kind of not helpful in some ways because it sounds very cold almost. It did help me, and I have seen it help many people. So one question that I have just asked to people is, when you find yourself replaying a situation that is the source of your grief, to just start to notice that. And then once you've started to notice this replaying, you can just ask yourself some questions about that. Like, why might I be wanting to think about that? And do I need to think about that because X, Y, or Z? And the reality is, for a lot of people, I have seen them be able to change the narrative of what starts to come to their minds. And that sometimes naturally happens to people in that process from grief to resiliency, I think. But for those people that are really stuck, that question can sometimes help them move into another side of it. Put it that way.
May I ask you a question?
Yes.
So the phrase that sounds so harsh, who's dying now, seems to me not to recognize that what the bereaved can't do is cope with the loss. So how did that help? Like, if you don't mind me asking.
Yeah, actually it wasn't done in terms of someone who had died. It was done in terms of someone, let's say, who was raped or who was beaten or who was whatever. So they were dealing with the grief of experiencing that. And so they were reliving those things and re-feeling it constantly. And so the person was asking them, that person isn't in the room with you right now.
Okay.
So, and no one's going to hurt you right at this moment. So let's deal with what helps you by bringing that to your mind. And it was very interesting to think of. So I don't know if that will help anyone.
So it's like a moment of stopping the narrative from running in the head and saying, I'm in a safe space right now. I'm safe now.
Yeah, it's sort of like shocking you back out of a replay that isn't necessarily helpful right at that moment. it isn't necessarily to remove any recollection of it. It's just that I think for some people who are really deep in a groove, if they can't have helps to move through it, it can become paralyzing.
Yeah, yeah. That was beautiful, thank you.
I know it's getting late, and since I'm Irish, I have to sort of end this with a story, another story. I had a brother who died, and I took care of all of the funeral arrangements, and my brother Kevin went with me to the funeral home because my mother and father were just so devastated. And on the way home, we realized, oh, that's right, Joseph will need a tie. He didn't have a tie for the wake. And so this is back in the olden days in New York. It was Memorial Day weekend, and the department stores used to be closed then, so there were only sort of boutique-y stores. And so Kevin and I stopped into this very fashionable boutique-y store, and I was looking through the ties, and my brother Kevin just kind of aimlessly walking about, and there was a gentleman helping me with the ties, very attentive, very attentive. He waited to see me picking out a tie, picked out one. He said, oh, that's a beauty, that's a beauty. I said, how much is this? He said, oh, that's $50. This was back in 1989. And I looked at Kevin and said, that's too much. It's only going to be worn once. And at that, the two of us erupted into a fit of laughter, which is without any equal in my life. I was getting abdominal cramps, so I am quite sure to this day that the salesperson still thinks, remember those two guys who fell off the turnip truck and came in here looking for a tie? But I mention this just because at that moment, in the midst of our grief, it was this great gift to us to be able to have that kind of laughter. Well, will you all please thank her?